Thank you. Yep, this is my face. I appreciate it. This is the first time we've done teams with a group of more than just like 3 people. We just started last week with the speakers for this week's director's webinar. So we're going to have Utah and Georgia speaking this week. And so we practice with them. We also have a technology project that's pretty cool that I think will be helpful to hear from. And so we have used it for small groups. We've never used it for big groups. But Lynn and I are just getting used to it. There's probably a raise your hand function. Is there? Does anyone know if there's a raise your hand function? I was going to see if people could raise their hand and show if they've used it before. But I don't see that option. We hadn't thought to try that.
Doesn't look like one.
Yeah, no. So I don't know. I mean, that's something I love, like the raise your hand, the clapping. We'll have to figure that out. But anyways, hopefully, if you're in here, you obviously knew what you're doing. Although a couple people are leaving now, so maybe they thought they were somewhere else. So welcome everybody. I think most of you, I recognize you by name. There's just a couple people I didn't recognize, so maybe you're new to the projects or a new evaluator. So welcome. I'm Jennifer Coffey. I'm the SPDIG program lead, and I also have projects. I'm project officer as well. And I also oversee the State Implementation Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices Technical Assistance Center, which does work to develop infrastructure in states to support the implementation of evidence-based practices, as the name implies. So let me talk a little bit about our purpose today. And while I do that, I'm going to open up my desktop so that you can see my slides. So the purpose of our meeting today is to talk about some of the changes that are coming and to get your feedback about them. So it's not just to tell you about the changes, because I did talk about that on the webinar, the director's webinar in February, was where I shared some of what was coming down the pike. So you got a heads up, and I'm kind of raised in other conversations. If you do want to see that, actually that's a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you where you can find, just because every once in a while I hear people who aren't sure of where things are. And so I'm going to show my desktop and then go straight here to SIG Network. And so this is the homepage. It changes fairly regularly. These are some recent events that we've had. So the MTSS Community of Practice, the Coaching Community of Practice, the SPDIG Directors webinar. The last one was about reaching rural families and was also about sustainability. So how you think about your SPDIG's sustainability. Kim St. Marin did a fantastic job of breaking down. What she did was she took a look at the measures that they had for their SPDIG and thought through sustainability for each of the measures. So what does it look like if we're doing this well, if we're doing this with an eye towards sustainability, what would that look like? So just a heads up about that. But if you wanted to find my presentation, a couple different ways to do it. The quick list has right here, you can get to the event link, and that's going to take you right to the recording. If you just want to go and grab the PowerPoint, you'd want to go to the events calendar. So you know from the quick list that this was in February. And so you can see, it's not like it's a very busy calendar. Go to the director's webinar. And then here you've got the event recording, the presentation slides, and the conversation transcript. A lot has happened since that webinar. And I have to say, I wasn't exactly sure what I had said about everything. And so to make sure I was consistent in my presentation today, I listened to the event recording this morning. So you never know when you're going to need it. But here you can listen to me talk about what was coming, because I'm not going to cover everything I did there. I also talked about sustainability and implementation teams, because that was one of the new requirements this year in the Dear Colleague directions. You were asked to provide some information about how you are supporting implementation teams in your SPDIG work, or how you're using them, and how you are planning for sustainability. So what your activities look like to get you ready for sustainability. It's something that you should be writing into a SPDIG application, those plans. You're thinking about it at the state level, how you sustain changes that are made and support and grow infrastructure that's going to keep things going. And also at, depending on the sites that you're working with, the kind of sites of your early childhood or K through 12, but you're thinking about how you are supporting the districts and the schools and the different settings in sustaining as well. So as always, it's a multi-level effort. All right, so let's start this from the beginning. All right, so the purpose of today is to share some of these changes that are coming and to get your feedback on how we roll that out, because I would always want to be careful about this, but I'm especially concerned with how we roll this out because everyone is so overwhelmed with what's happening, including myself. And as I say that, I'm going to ask my son to turn down the volume of his Go Doodle dance. So wait one moment. Shoot. Hey, bud. Oh, I'm back on. All right. Sorry, I lost you for a second. That was my network. Too many things going on in this house, and I'm sure in yours as well. So I am going to go back. Len, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, and it looks like I'm still sharing, so I'm going to go back to my presentation. And Len, just let me know if I get to a bad quality.
You might minimize your toolbar there, the little black box with the.
Oh, good. That's a good idea. And actually, I'll stop my video in case that helps with my sharing quality.
It's that flat one on the right. There you go.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So Section C changes were those implementation teams and planning for sustainability that I just talked about. Upcoming changes to Program Measure 1 that I talked about in the February webinar were the measure itself doesn't change. So the naming of the measure, how we call it in our GEPRA language, Government Performance Results Act, which is what we're doing with what we show Congress to show how we're doing, is an aggregate of the program measures together. So we, OSEP, have a GEPRA measure, then you get to take that and create your program measure related to it. And your program measure language in your status chart is not going to need to change. It's the evidence-based professional development rubric that's changing. So what you're responding to is going to be changing a bit. So this is just, I'll talk more about it, but this is our agenda for today. And then upcoming changes to Program Measure 2 language. So that is about improving your implementation. So we're going to try to get closer to what is happening to the child. Some of you are already there. Some of you are already capturing an intervention that the child, at the child level, the child is receiving, or the youth. I'm saying child as whoever is the end recipient, who is child, individual, student, youth, infant, toddler with disabilities. But we're trying to get at what's the closest thing that's going to impact the child outcome. And it won't mean that you can't capture like the MTSS rubric as implementation fidelity, etc. But we also want this. So that would stay, you could have that as a project measure, but for a program measure, we're moving toward the thing that's the closest to the student with disabilities. So I'll talk more about that. The new long-term measure, which is about child impact. So children with disabilities, how are you impacting them with your work? And then I also just wanted to get some feedback on how it went submitting your draft program measures this year, but that's not the first thing on our list. So any questions about the agenda, anything I don't have on here that you wish I would talk about? Okay. So what was new this year, of course, was that you had to talk about your state implementation teams and also your plan for sustainability. And I just wanted to get some feedback. Were the directions what you needed? Did you have any issues, any problems, anything we need to know about for next time around if we do have something in that nature? I'm going to go ahead and let's see the conversation. Len, if you wouldn't mind just telling me if anyone brings up a topic or a response to me in there. And you also, everyone, feel free to use your phone. It's certainly easier for me if people do that.
Will do.
Okay, thanks.
Jennifer?
Yes.
This is Carolyn Cherry in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So, not sure what the timing is of people getting feedback related to what was provided, but probably having that will help us potentially give you feedback about the how did this go or thoughts related
I know
to.
so you're talking about you're not talking about the project officer feedback, you're talking about the external evaluators or the contractors and what they have to say.
Sure, or I guess if there clearly was a purpose to someone wanting this information, and so whatever that feedback loop is to states, to say, yes, we hit the mark, or no, we didn't, or.
Now I understand what you're saying. Sorry, I was missing. Okay. Yes. So you are talking about this. You're talking about the implementation teams and sustainability. So I happen to be your project officer. So it would be how I respond, showing that it was a worthwhile contribution in the APR. You know, that I use that information. Am I summarizing that appropriately?
That's probably one piece. I mean, when you say, how did this go for you, or any thoughts for us? It was, I think, because we use implementation teams in Minnesota, it was fairly easy to use that language in response to the questions. But how is this information going to get used down the road, or what other pieces as far as a narrative or what kinds of things you're looking for as this evolves may be helpful.
Got it. Okay. Good. That's really helpful. Yep, I agree. It's evolving, right? We'll figure it out. Thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate it. Other comments?
Yeah, Jeremiah Pope says, if there's time, could you give us more information about the proposed priority and definitions, SPDIG regs that came out last week?
I can, yeah, definitely, if there's time. Okay. So upcoming changes. So a big part of this feedback, as I said, is how we roll it out. Just going to get into it. You know, we've already given you, actually, I did a different, I thought of different ways I wanted to roll this out. So I was getting ahead of myself about program measure 1, but I just was saying that the evidence-based professional development, the components of that, we had conversations about it before, a couple years back. And from those conversations, and that was at the project directors conference at the program area meeting specifically. And from that, we took your recommendations, we made changes, and then we waited a couple of years because things were so busy, and we work with the budget office on changes to GEPRA/program measures. And they were just too busy to work on anything. So we waited a little while, and then we got a new person, met with him, and then kind of started the process again. So just so you understand the lag. And then from there, we shared with we shared with the evaluators. A group of evaluators came together, actually met face to face, went through it, worked on what made the most sense in that updated evidence-based professional development rubric worksheet. And then from there, CSEP took a look at it because so much of it was based on implementation science. We wanted to make sure it was up to date with what they had learned over time working from you all. And so then we took that and we brought it back to you all. And I shared that, I believe it was the February webinar. And then we put it up on SIG Network and allowed people to give us feedback. I did not receive any more feedback. It doesn't mean it's closed forever, but just to let you know, let me show you where that is living right now. So on the home page, you slide down. Here's the draft revised EBPD worksheet. Go like this, and you're going to download it, and then you'll be able to open it up from there. So if you still want to give me feedback, just let me know it's coming, and we can wait for you. But just so you know, that's been the process so far. So that's been happening already, and then I'm going to get into some of the longer term. So we were looking for a long-term measure, and we wanted to do child outcome measures. We've kind of been talking about that, so I'll talk about that today. And then the fidelity terminology, want to change that to be about intervention fidelity and not implementation fidelity. And then program measure 2, also with that fidelity terminology, we want to change that from a measure of something like an MTSS rubric. Those are important, but we want to get a fidelity measure that's closer to the child outcomes, as I was saying. So those are the big changes. So for the long-term program measure, that child outcomes, this is the draft GEPRA language. So what I was talking about in the introduction was GEPRA is what we OSEP report to Congress. To get this GEPRA information, we need your program measures, and then we aggregate those, and then we give the aggregate to Congress. And so percent of initiatives that meet their child outcome targets. So you can tell by this that it's going to be your own targets, at least to start with. I don't know that we'd ever change that, but you're going to be looking at, here's my initiative. This is what we want to happen to child outcomes as a result of it. And we think this is a reasonable target to set. And then you're going to just tell us on your APR how you're doing against that target. Many of you already have child outcome targets, but this would make it a program measure as opposed to a project measure. So I'll go through this, and then I'm going to take questions about the long-term measure, the outcome measure. So with MTSS, or a literacy initiative, this is what a program measure might look like. After 2 years of professional development, 50% of third grade students with disabilities in SPDIG supported schools will meet their spring reading benchmark. If your baseline was 30%, that might be reasonable. PBIS example, after 3 years of professional development, office discipline referrals were decreased by 30% for students with disabilities in SPDIG supported schools. So hopefully these are smart measures. I think they are. I think they've got all the elements in them. They're just examples I made up, but I think they were fairly reasonable. So this is, you're taking your initiative, and the big idea is that if you're doing good professional development, it should improve fidelity of the intervention, which should then result in the child level outcome improving. Doesn't always happen that way. You might need to get some qualitative data together if things aren't going well, even after you have fidelity. There are other ways to look at it, but generally that's what we think will happen. That's what we aim for. So the thinking right now is that this would be a pilot measure for 2017 grantees in the coming year. Pilot measure means we don't have to report it to Congress. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's just giving us information about what you're doing so we can learn from that. You're learning from going through the process and having the conversation with us. So it's just really kind of practicing. Okay, questions about what a pilot measure is, questions about what we're looking for in terms of this measure. I'll be quiet now and listen for you. And Len, do you see anything in the chat pod?
Nothing yet.
Jennifer, this is Jeremy from Kentucky.
Hi, Jeremy.
So with the examples you just gave us, if we look beyond into the next grant cycle, it would be appropriate to 9.9 that program measure for the first 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. And what Jeremy is talking about is 999 is what, because the APR system, most of you know this by now, does not take zeros, just like a plain old zero. 999 is what is used when it's not yet appropriate to give the data there, or they don't have the data yet. And then because NA, non-applicable, is used for qualitative measures. Sorry, that's a little in depth, but other questions or thoughts?
Jennifer, this is Carolyn in Minnesota.
Hi, Carolyn.
Hello again. So has there been thought around the length of time it takes to have a change in a child outcome measure in comparison to ramping up or the work that states would do related to SPDIG?
Yeah, so far we've been thinking it would be the final, the 5th year that we would expect people to get to their final desired child outcome. And it wouldn't be, you can work with cohorts with this. So it could be your first, if you're doing a cohort model. So this could be your first cohort being in their 4th year of implementation. And we can definitely take feedback on that as well. I didn't add it to this list, but I think it's a good discussion.
Jennifer?
Yes.
This is Steve Goodman.
Hi.
With this, when you're looking at student outcomes, I know there's always a lot of discussion around connecting it to fidelity at implementation.
Mm-hmm.
How would that be addressed here?
So tell me if I'm not getting your question right. At one point in time, we were thinking about the GEPRA measure being that we would only look at impact for those, we say, schools that had shown fidelity, or classrooms or teachers, that you'd only look at impact then. But that's not really fair to do. So we took that, that's my thinking at least. So the connection should be there in your APR and in your story generally, that you have for an initiative, you talk about how you're doing an evidence-based professional development. So you're using good strategies in professional development. From there, you are showing the impact on intervention fidelity through your program measure. You also will probably have a project measure about, those implementation fidelity supports, like what's happening with MTSS, for example. But the intervention fidelity for the program measure. And then from there, you're showing what the child outcomes are. So you are telling that story, and if your fidelity is not getting there and the child outcomes aren't getting there, then that's the story you're telling. And it hopefully is good data for you to figure out the changes that you want to make. And some of you are already doing all this, so I'm not to say that that's not happening. But it'll be the first time we report it to Congress. And one thing that programs are careful about, and I'm not as careful, I'm sure, as others, but GEPRA, if things don't go well, it could hurt our program. And so there is sometimes a desire to go a little easier on these, but we've always wanted to have meaningful measures for GEPRA. And for our work, to me, these are meaningful. And because it's SIG Network that put them all together originally, I know that the different projects, the different evaluators felt the same way. And that's why we're having these conversations too. But one of the things that came up over time, and I'm sorry, I'm meandering here, but I think it's important, is that every single year we're asked for our child level outcomes to show Congress that we should continue to be funded at our current level. And, you never know, maybe we could increase our funding someday. So they want the child outcomes, but we haven't been asking for it for program measures. So sometimes it's given to us, but not always. And so it's a real problem not to have a bigger pool to draw from of the child level outcomes. So that's why we wanted to make this the long-term measure, because it tells the whole story of good professional development, leads to improved implementation, leads to child outcomes. And we also wanted to have those strong data. You're doing such good work. And if we don't have it in the APRs, it's difficult for us to pull it together and give it to Congress. Does that make sense, Steve?
It does. And so what I'm hearing is this should be considered as part of a whole package,
right?
Ultimately getting down to the student level, but also it's a clear connection to logic models, theory of action that we have to have in our proposals anyway. So. Yeah,
and actually, interestingly, a logic model or theory of action is not required currently in the SPDIG notices. Just because we're so tight in terms of sticking to statutory language with that, and it's challenging to add other requirements. We've never added that as a requirement. It's an SSEP requirement, but it's not a SPDIG requirement, which does not mean that reviewers don't look for it when they're reviewing. It's just not a requirement, just to be specific.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. We'll keep on moving. We can always go back.
Jennifer Sullivan. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. Sorry. It's very late. Can you speak up a little bit?
Peg Sullivan.
Hi, Peg.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Okay. I'm just wrapping my brain around this. So I'm thinking in terms of the current project. I always mix up project and program. It's project that's ours and program that are yours, right?
Correct. Right.
Okay. So I'm just wrapping my head around the current project measures that we have that speak to looking at schools that have reached a certain criteria in terms of fidelity of implementation before we start reporting on the student. So I'm just going to pull numbers out of the air. So with our Check and Connect schools, we say that they demonstrate over a period of time that they've met fidelity of implementation criteria to 80% or above. Mm-hmm. The expectation is they have to hit that marker by no later than the 4th year of the grant. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, we start reporting on the student performance data. Is tying those two together going to be allowed with this, or is it just, do you know what I'm saying? Or is it just going to be that at certain years into the grant, you're expected to report the student outcome data?
It's going to be at the end, the way that we're conceptualizing it, it's going to be at the end of the grant. So the big idea is that, like I said, you could just choose a single cohort as long as it wasn't too small, and that's something we need to work out a little bit. But you could take, if you were doing cohorts, you could take your first cohort and at the end of your grant, that's the cohort you'd look at for impact.
Okay.
So it's not that it doesn't matter. It's not that you don't need to tell that story that this group of schools, say, met their fidelity targets in the intervention, and had the impact. So you would make it clear in the explanation of progress if there was a large number of that cohort that didn't make it to fidelity, and therefore the student outcomes weren't what you expected. You would just describe that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, I
Yeah.
apologize if this is too technical a question. In the 5th year APR that's due in May, we report the program measures, and then at the end of the 5th year, we do the final report. For instance, with a student outcome measure, we would not be given those and be able to report them until the final report, because there's always a 1-year lag in implementation to when the student data is released and given to us. So are you able to use the final report for GEPRA, or can you only use the May APRs?
I'm pretty sure we can use the final report. I think how we were conceiving it before is that we'd ask for it in the 5th year and then also take the data from the final year, kind of like we do, in the fidelity measure right now. We start at 3rd year and we go all the way through, the final report. So I think it would be the 5th year and then the final report that we would take for it. But, I think it's a good idea for us to collect, OSEP to collect all these thoughts and to come back together. And once we get all your ideas like this, then it'll get us thinking about what that looks like because I've never had a long-term measure for this program. So I've never had to figure that out. And so we're kind of doing that as we go along.
Jennifer, this is Carolyn. I'm going to guess that one of the challenges for you in having a long-term measure when we think about implementation, that's right 5 to 7 years out, not at the end of 5. So how this is framed and trying to think about what is the actual impact depending on how people are designing their grants, what level they're implementing, all of those things go into a potential factor that is a child outcome. So it could be a rather small group of students. So those would be all the questions or how this is laid out and concerns that I might have depending on what the expectations are on states as they, especially for those that are doing this or are the ones who are having to pilot this.
Yeah, no, I think those are good questions. I've certainly have seen that in SPDIGs that were able to make significant impacts. There's one grantee that was able to decrease the gap between children with disabilities and children without in an area by 45%. So it can happen within the life of the grant. And I think we'll be learning a lot about not just the processes, how to set up the measures, but also how to get there from having these conversations, because having it as a program measure where everyone is in it together is going to certainly get the conversation going. So as I said, there's a desire to do well on your program measure or, your GREPRA measures, but I have a big desire, and I know you all do, to continue to improve our work to be the best possible. And since the SPDIGs, you all are the leaders in the field of supporting implementation and getting that impact, I think it's going to drive the wider field, having these conversations and having some, the shared language about the measures or shared need at least, and having a little bit of a fire under all of us to figure it out. I think, Carolyn, too, it'll be interesting to see with the SEP what has been learned by you all, and not just Minnesota, but other states from your SEP work that we can also bring back to the SPDIG when it comes to this. All right, so the changes to the evidence-based professional development rubric. So this is program measure 1. Many of you know it and hopefully love it. The EBPD rubric that we have, and then you turn in a worksheet for that. And then the measure itself, the program measure, is about hitting a certain, it's the target we set for you. And so a certain number of those components each year that you should be getting a 3 or a 4 on. And it goes up after year 2. So I'm going to show you the Word document that we are at right now. So this is the latest edition. And we got to a point where there were too many changes to keep it as a track changes document. It would have completely overwhelmed you. And so what you have now is the new descriptions on the left, the previous descriptions on the right. So you just have to kind of compare side by side. It just wasn't going to work otherwise. And so you can see for clear expectations, not a ton of changes for the PD participants, the clear expectations for trainers and coaches. There were some, but not too significant. Training, you can see just from looking one side to the other that there were some definite changes. Adult learning strategies, not too much. Skill-based, we made some. When I say we, there was a great group of evaluators. Some of you are on the call right now who took a look at this, and then CSEP worked on it, and then many of you had already given us your feedback a few years back. You can see that the trainers are trained, coached, and observed. That came much longer from here than the previous description to now. So there are more elements to that. Administrators are trained now as its own section here. There was no thing that looked, training outcome data looked like this, but it was not B6 before. So some of it's a little bit confusing in terms of how things have moved around as well in terms of comparison. So one way you could look at it is just looking at the new ones and seeing if you could agree on that. And as always, when you're reporting, it's really useful to use these bullets and then describe what you're doing for the bullets. And I think that's going to help in this new process too. You can see that these titles have remained the same. This looks a bit different. So this is one of the bigger changes. We now have a C3, didn't have that before. So coaching, the third component. And then the decision support data system was where I thought we needed the biggest changes, just because it was just duplicative. There were lots of things that showed up in different places. So there's now D3, and then we go right to E, which is the administrative support systems. So, I really, if you haven't had a chance to yet, I recommend you take a look at the changes to give, at least to get a sense of them. Give me feedback if you'd like to. But again, we want your feedback about how to go about this. So would it work for you to respond to new EBPD rubric this year, or do you absolutely want to stay out your grant using the old version? And then if you have a new grant later on down the line, that's when you would change to the new rubric.
Brent says finishing out with the rubric we started with. Tom says what Brent said.
Okay.
Carolyn says would likely recommend a phased-in process. Peg says if I know now, I can adjust and plan to do the new one. And Chattanooga says if the new revised rubric is the new revised rubric shared with us, then we can review and decide. Jessica says, I agree finishing out, possibly adding an additional indicator might be okay, but to change the entire rubric might be difficult. I agree with Peg. And Stacy says, I think beginning in the next grant cycle makes more sense. And Paula says, IBID Brent. And Susan says, I agree with Brent.
People don't say IBID enough. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lynn. So again, if you missed the beginning of the presentation, this is where on the SIG Network homepage, signetwork.org, this is where we have, so under news, we have the draft revised EBPD worksheet. You click on that. We had asked people to do it by April 15th. I know a lot's going on, so I can certainly extend that. Is it reasonable to ask people to take a look and give me feedback by May 15th?
Carolyn says yes. Jessica says yes. Paula says yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So let's say May 15th. Heads up, we will be using the new version. And this is something I said in the February webinar. We will be using the new version with the new cohort that we get of the SPDIGs for fiscal year 2020. I don't know that it'll be part of the notice inviting applicants. I don't, I think there's a link to SIG Network. I don't think people have to, they have to talk about generally how they'll respond to the program measures. It's not like you're giving specifics about your EBPD worksheet in there or anything like that, but we will be using the new rubric / worksheet for the next cohort. All right. So changes to program measure 2. So I love this. This is, it's not a great image that I was able to capture, but there's an infographic that AIR and CII, National Center on Intensive Intervention, created about fidelity. And it's based on my favorite article about fidelity. I've talked about it forever. I used it in my dissertation, so it was a long time ago, but I think it still sticks. But that really, fidelity is more than just something being there and not being there, right? A component being there and not being there. It's about how, in this case, we're talking about student engagement, but it's how it's received, right? Are they actually engaged in it? And when you're giving it, is it specific? What's the quality delivery? What's exposure duration? What we generally look at is just adherence, and that's, we'll get there. We'll get to the other components, but I just was sharing that. That's my fave. So changes to program measure 2. So the language itself will not change for the GEPRA measure. It's going to be how your program measures are worded. So it's going to be about the fidelity of the intervention that impacts child outcomes. As I said, many of you are doing something along the lines of multi-tiered systems of support or positive behavioral interventions and support, response to intervention. Not terminology isn't used as much anymore, but that is used as well. If you're doing a multi-tiered system of support, no doubt you need a rubric, some kind of measurement of how those components are being used. That's really, really, really important. And it would remain one of your measures, but you would label it as a project measure, and you would be capturing the intervention that you think is going to get you the child outcomes you're desiring. So if you want children to improve their reading, and that's really the important thing that this SPDIG is supposed to get at, that's the need that you found when you wrote your application, is child literacy or third grade literacy, say, for example, then you would talk about the intervention that's going to improve child literacy. And whatever that happens to be, and you would capture the fidelity of that intervention. So the question about this is, would you like to start to pilot this program measure, or would you like to wait again? And if you're funded for another SPDIG, then you would start at that time. And some of you may already be doing this.
Carolyn says she would recommend waiting. And Peg says she would prefer to wait. As does Sydney.
Okay. So it sounds like waiting.
And Paula.
Okay. So I'm hearing some consistency. All right. All right, then I will move on. So no changes for program measure 3 or 4 at this time. So 3 being, what you do after initial training to support fuller implementation or sustainability. Measure 4 being those of you who have an objective of teacher retention. So we're not changing those. All right, so any final thoughts or questions about what I've shared so far? Okay.
So this is Patty. I just want to say one quick thing. Patty from Kansas. Patty Noon. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say that before you decide whether or not to use the updated EBPB rubric for next year, I would definitely take a look at it and think about it carefully, because I was a part of a group that really worked on that, and the efforts were to really make it more clear, and we changed the flow and tried to make it highly useful. So it's been attempted to improve with projects in mind. So I'm just putting a pitch out there to consider it.
Thanks, Patty. I think that is helpful. Yeah, I know it's a hard time to make changes. So I get where people are coming from, but yeah, it was definitely, we were doing that work, even going back a little bit further when we first were having these conversations at the project directors conference, the program area meeting. And I think I brought this up in the February presentation, is Scott Ross brought up, we were talking about making the long-term measure about changes in the state and what you've done to create infrastructure, et cetera, which is good. But what he said at that point was, could you just include this all in the rubric? And I came around to, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, not to give you a new measure about that, and instead to include it in what you're already doing. So I think it's a good efficiency, because again, 2012 was when the rubric was finalized, and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about implementation science. We've learned a lot just about professional development and what works, and so we want that to be shown in how you talk about your work, and that's through the evidence-based professional development worksheet. So Yeah, I get not wanting to make changes, but it's true. Maybe once you look at it, you might think, oh, this is already stuff I'm doing, and it wouldn't be hard to respond to this, or, this different format wouldn't be hard to do. So thank you. All right.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
This is Carolyn. Has there been any discussion about the format of the worksheet and how people are needing to enter information into it for responses?
No, I've never had any complaints.
Okay. Maybe because people didn't know whether they could provide any feedback.
I don't know. I get a lot of feedback, but maybe. Yeah, I tend to hear from evaluators what's going on, but maybe I don't know.
Maybe not about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, I think I would have suggestions, especially when it comes to accessibility kinds of issues. And what we have to go through to make it accessible for other places that we use it.
So currently it's a Word document. So what would it be instead of a Word document?
I think it's as a Word document that it's formatted as a table. So as people are trying to report data or images or other kinds of things within the table format, it makes it challenging. It sounds like that you're looking for point by point for the bullets on one side to respond to those on the other. And it seems like rather than having to have a side by side, the form could be designed in a way for those as prompts. If that's what you're really needing and wanting, the form could be designed to do that rather than people having to copy paste or organize that information and having to respond to it in a different way. So just thinking about how forms are designed helps elicit responses if you're looking for specific things, and then what flexibility does the form have in ensuring that we can report to you the information that answers those questions.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. We could definitely do that. All right, good. Okay, so anything else? I was going to try to respond to, I think it was Jeremy asked in the beginning, to the request for a notice of proposed priority to show that. But anything else before we do that? Okay, let me share. Okay, so this is the notice of proposed priority. If you have specific questions, please feel free to call me. I am very happy to talk about it. And that's really what you're supposed to do. Anytime a notice comes out, if you have questions, please go to the person who's listed as the ed contact. One thing I wanted to point out, so the comments are due toward the end of May. You are going to do this in comment, they give you how to do the comments. There is an option to write in. Please try to do it in the system if at all possible, because mail is not great right now and we want to get your comments. There was a question about the definition somebody asked earlier, or someone wanted to ask a question about the definition. So what was the question about the definitions?
I was curious if this is a change that's opening up flexibility for states, or if this is a change where all states in the future will have to include this evidence-based opportunity that's more user-driven.
So you think evidence-based has changed in a way that's more user-driven?
How to word it? The priority in the definition seemed to be adding into the definition of a SPDIG that your professional development would be that the participants could choose and have more choice in what the PD is. And I was curious, is this change in the definition of SPDIG giving states more flexibility to do that if they want to, or is this a change where states must do this?
So at the very end, so one, you kind of asked a question about the future. I don't know the future of what things could become, but in terms of what this asks, you can see this is a really important paragraph, what it states. So we intend for this proposed priority to supplement the absolute priority 2, the SPDIG statutory priority, published in the Federal Register on February 13, 2017, as well as other relevant statutory and regulatory priorities established by the department. Specifically, all applicants must meet the statutory requirements in sections 651 through 655 of the IDEA. Applicants may apply for this proposed priority as well, but would not be required to do so to be eligible for an award. So I think that's one of the more critical paragraphs here, saying that this is going to be an optional effort and that you still have to fulfill everything that is in IDEA about the SPDIG, which has not changed, since IDEA came out. It was in the statute. Does that help?
It does. We were curious if, while it may not be required to be eligible, would there still be points tied to it in the application?
It's true that it is left open as to the kind of priority it would be. So that is potentially the case. We don't know yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And there is a point, our points made in the notice talking about, maybe there's a group of teachers or a group of personnel, because the SPDIG, in the definitions, the SPDIG is about personnel as defined in IDEA, which is a very large group of people who work with children with disabilities. But what was I saying before I started scrolling? So it talks about groups of personnel. So maybe you just want to, with speech therapists or speech and language therapists, you want to give them an opportunity to choose their own professional development with such, I'm just giving an example, but just a specific group that you want to give this choice to, and that you're also going to have other things. So it just, if you read it carefully, it gives you some different thoughts about how this might be done that are not your entire project. It is just how you would get at something that you'd like to see if autonomy would help to improve, the impact of the professional development. We have 3 more minutes. So any other questions about the notice right now? And we really do welcome comment. There were 2 priorities that came out close to each other that had the same teacher choice or personnel choice aspect to them. And it's come out in the news too, that the secretary is saying that she thinks that this is really important for teachers, other personnel to have choice in their professional development. So it's certainly something that the secretary is putting support behind, but we need to hear about how that would look for a SPDIG, how that would look for your state, what you think of it. So please do feel free to comment. Any other questions?
Jennifer, it's Patty. You were talking earlier about if we'd be willing to update our fidelity measures, and it was tied to this discussion about student outcomes. So I guess I didn't understand what exactly you meant. Like, should states look at improving their fidelity measures to make a more logical flow all the way down to student outcomes? Is that what you're saying?
I said a few different things like that, so I'm not sure which time you're talking about, but the big idea was that, we want the intervention fidelity measure that's closest to the student or the child as a way to try to connect those 2. Okay,
so classroom level.
Yes, in many cases, yes.
Not too far removed from, I understand the practice that's touching or reaching the child.
Right, exactly.
Okay, That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And I've had the question, well, does that mean you think it's not important to capture what's happening, at the whole school level or the district level? And absolutely not. I really think those are important. It was just, they would be your project measures. We could make it another program measure, but we don't want to have too many program measures. We had to have a long-term measure. So we had to add that. We've always known that. We should have had one years ago. But other than that, we're trying to work within the number of measures we have right now and not add anything new.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your feedback. Again, May 15th for your comments on the EBPD worksheet. If you need more time than that, email me. But I appreciate everyone being open with your feedback today, and certainly understand the desire for not a lot of changes to come your way at this moment. And I look forward to hearing from you if you have any other questions.
Carolyn says, could Jennifer please send an email with that info to attendees and link to the form?
I'm going to put the link in here right now, signetwork.org. It's on the homepage. But yes, we will also send an email to the entire listserv to remind people about the opportunity to provide feedback to the form. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lynn. Have a good afternoon. Okay. Bye.